Hey, welcome back everybody. This week I'm going to show you how we made this speaker box for a 70 Mustang. So starting out in the back seat area of this 70 Mustang, you can see we don't have a whole lot of room. And what you can buy off the shelf or online is these kind of square, bulky looking boxes that really don't fit the space all that well. So the first thing that we're going to end up doing is we got to make a floor for that box to sit on. We got to kind of level that out. As you can see, it's so oddly shaped that we make it, pretty close with a jigsaw, and then we go back in and trace the floor with an offset, and then we can trim that to fit exactly. We kind of do the same thing for the sides of the box because it has a little bit of an arch in the back there. Make it out of cardboard, then we'll transfer that all to wood. And this is kind of what it looks like once you get the pieces kind of put together. So the next thing I had to do was make the inserts for the subwoofers. And I have these handy little plastic rings that come in all different shapes and sizes. And how they work is you just find the center of wherever you're about to cut your hole, and they have these nice little grooves in the plastic ring themselves. So it makes lining up the center for your cut really, really easy. These are the grooves here, so you can line them up on the marks that you made on your board, and your circle's always going to be centered. Next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and put that double-sided tape. I'll put links to all the products and stuff that we use down in the description below. We put this double-sided tape on the ring so we can take this over to the router, and then it'll flush trim a perfect circle when it's all said and done. So we'll tape this down. We'll put a little hole in it kind of close to the edge so the router bit can get through, and then cut away. So I'm using a 1/4 inch flush trim router bit with a top writing bearing. So as you see, you just stick it through the hole that you drilled, go over to your edge, and it just follows whatever, it could be a circle, a square, whatever you got going on up top, and it just perfectly rides that, and you get a perfect cut every time. You want to be kind of careful here towards the end. Make sure the router comes to a complete stop before you remove the piece from the router table. Whenever you have a piece floating in the middle, that's where you can kind of have that chatter, and it could damage your product. So we duplicate that on the other side to make both, and as you can see, it's a perfect fit. You don't want a whole lot of slop or movement in where you're going to mount your subwoofer. So the next big hurdle we had is we didn't want that square box look, so we wanted a nice gradual curve, and how we accomplished that is by cutting a slight angle on each side of the board, so you really eliminate any of that gap or spacing that you'd have if you just butted two straight 90-degree cuts. So we take it over to the table saw, we'll rip little strips at, I think we did like a 6-degree angle or something like that. Just cut nice little 2-inch boards. You can go thinner if you want, to make sure that you don't have any of like peaks. But I think we ran it at about 2 inches, and then glue them all together, and then you can sand the top. You're really just kind of nicking the very top of the board, so you don't have anything kind of sticking out. You don't have that choppy look. You get a nice smooth radius. One thing that we did on the underside of it to kind of reinforce it is we went ahead and fiberglassed it. I put 2 or 3 layers on there to really kind of beef it up. With those subwoofers and stuff vibrating, you don't want anything breaking loose, especially on a big curve like that. So we needed to add a little bit of a decorative piece on top. So same principle, make it out of cardboard. We transferred it over to metal, put it in a slip roller, put a nice little curve on it to kind of match the box. Then we went ahead and put spacers on with a stainless steel button head Allen bolt. It's going to be seen, so we need it to be a little bit decorative. But we gapped it, and that's going to be important. I'll show you why we did that a little bit later on. And after we get those kind of bolted on, we'll take it over to the car and we want to test fit everything before we start wrapping it. We want to make sure that we made it so there's enough gaps that once we apply the leather to the box itself, everything's going to fit just right. So one cool thing that we do for a lot of insert panels and top mount panels like this is they're all held on by magnets. And you know, if you want to see how we do that, drop a comment down below, and then maybe we'll make a video on that process a little bit later on. Once you get everything test fitted and everything kind of checked out, we moved on to applying our material. I started with that inside portion of the box first. Make sure you're gluing both the material and the box. It's a two-part contact weldwood adhesive that we use on pretty much everything. You get it in aerosol cans, you can get it by 5-gallon buckets. 3M spray adhesive works just as well, but you know, if I'm using so much of it, this is just kind of a go-to for a lot of upholstery shops.
Rage on that beat, going crazy.
So once we got the sides of the box and some of the little panels wrapped, I use this little thing here. It's a bobbin. You could use a ball bearing, anything like that that's going to allow you to get a 1/2 inch spacing on a flat surface. This next piece I'm going to do is going to be sewn, so I have to allow for the seam allowance, and that's how I do that. Is instead of making a line, then going back with a ruler and finding 1/2 inch from that line, you can just ride it with a ball bearing, or an M-style bobbin is what I'm using here, and that gives me my perfect seam allowance a lot quicker to do that. So I'll do that on both sides, and then we'll move over to the side piece, you know, the two pieces that I'm going to be sewing together, cut all that out, and then we'll do some stitch work. Once I got all my pieces cut out, I then started making reference marks that, so when I go to sew it, I don't get off, because the material will have a tendency to stretch as you're sewing along. So I just kind of line up the ends, kind of work the piece slowly through. Wherever it's making contact, that's where I'll make a reference mark. So after I make all my reference marks, I use these pig ear notchers, and I go through and I'll make a little clip, because once the material's underneath the machine, I can't see those marks. So if I make a little nick, you know, making sure I don't go past my 1/2 inch seam allowance, I can see those and line up each tick mark when I'm going to stitch it together. Once I got everything stitched together, it was time to stretch it over the top portion of the box. I kind of flip everything inside out, and then that way you can just roll it around the seam. You're not trying to stretch and pull that that tight corner. That's where you're going to typically have something rip out on you if you try to pull that and force it. Where you tend to roll it, it just seems to fold right over and keeps everything intact. So once I got that all in place and everything was looking pretty good on the top side, we flipped the piece over and spray glue the back side. Alright, once I got all that put together, it was time to move over to the accent pieces that go on top. I actually traced the design out on the foam first and then glued that to the leather. That way I could kind of map out where my top stitch lines were going to be on the foam. And I didn't want to make a whole bunch of marks on the leather since it is white, and white's relatively unforgiving. With the marks transferred over to the front side of the leather, I'm stitching this with T270 thread, and if you're new to the upholstery world, it's basically sewing with rope. Super thick. You want to make sure that your machine's dialed in before you attempt this. You know, run a few test pieces with the foam, the same kind of material that you're using, to make sure that stitch length and everything isn't going to bind up on you. I sew with a Juki, what is it? It's an LU 1508N. Great machine. I've never had a day of problems with it. You know, I started out with a FAF, let's see, a 1245. It was a super old thing with a clutch motor. And once I made the transition to this Juki with a servo, man, was that like the Cadillac of all machines. And for those out there that do upholstery work, let me know what machine you're running in the comments section down below. Now that we got those pieces all stitched together, it's time to glue it to the metal accent panel. I went ahead and trimmed off any of the excess foam so that foam would actually match the metal panel itself. I didn't want that extra bulk wrapping around the back side of that metal piece. Once we got those pieces wrapped, we attached LED strips to the bottom side of it to give it a soft underglow look, and then put a piece of ABS plastic on the underside as well to hide any of the bare metal or any of the wrapped over leather piece that you might see while looking through the back window of the Mustang. Once we get that last piece bolted on, this is kind of the final look. And from here, it's time to start installing it in the car. We're using a little bit longer bolt that's going to go through our base that we made into some nut certs that we set into the car. This will make sure the box doesn't slide or go anywhere. After making sure that we're extra careful not to scratch the leather, it's time to bolt the main subwoofer enclosure to the base that we made. The same kind of principle, we just had wood zerts that go into the base, and then that bolts into that. Once we got that all in, we pull up the speaker wires and the lighting wires, and we get the subwoofers wired up. Now I'm using a JL10TW3-D4, I believe. It's a 4 ohm shallow mount 10-inch subwoofer. Great for hot rods and stuff like this that has a small area but you want the most bang for your buck. Now that I have the subwoofers all wired up and in, it was time to wire up the lights. And a little pro tip, if you have the foresight to do it, and we do this quite a bit in the shop, is we'll actually use two different connectors for the terminals for the positive and negative. That way you don't ever mess up hooking them up, so you're not hooking up two positives together. It can only go together one way. Now that we got everything kind of hooked up, wired up, it's time to bolt this top piece into the box. And after that, we'll put that bottom face piece in where we use the magnets to secure them. Another thing you can kind of notice on the back side there, that we actually router about a 1/4 inch in on the back side, so that has a nice place for the leather or whatever material you're using to wrap around and not add to the thickness of the board, so everything's flush and mounted. And once we get that snapped in, that's it. I think it really turned out pretty darn cool, if you ask me. It sounds amazing for sure. Definitely one of a kind and a good way to clean up that back end of a Mustang without having a giant square box. If you found this video useful or interesting, make sure you hit like and subscribe. We do weekly videos on how-tos, tips and tricks, and walk-arounds of the cool projects that we do. I'm Sam Mapes with Sam's Upholstery, and we'll see you next time.